Garrett Hollow didn't knock. He never knocked. He kicked the gate open hard enough to crack the post, rode his horse straight into Evelyn Mercer's yard at 7 in the morning, and pulled up just short of her porch steps like the ground beneath him belonged to no one but himself. 3 of his men fanned out behind him. None of them bothered to remove their hats. 18 months is a long time to play stubborn, Evelyn. His voice was flat, almost bored, the way a man sounds when he's already decided how something ends. I'm not riding out here again. You sign the papers today, or I'll have the bank call your note by Friday. She didn't answer him. He smiled at that silence like it was an answer good enough. If you've ever watched someone lose everything they love one piece at a time and still refuse to quit, then stay with me. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The morning Evelyn Mercer buried her husband, the sky above the Wyoming Territory was the color of old pewter, flat, heavy, and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. She stood at the graveside in a black dress that had belonged to her mother, holding a handful of frozen dirt she couldn't bring herself to throw. The preacher said words. She heard none of them. Thomas Mercer had been dead 4 days before anyone found him at the bottom of the North Ravine, his horse gone, one boot missing, the back of his head caved in the way a fall can do when a man goes over a ledge in the dark. The deputy who came to the door had called it an accident before he even sat down at her kitchen table. He'd said it with such comfortable certainty that Evelyn had looked at him a long time without speaking. "You saw him?" she finally asked. "Saw the scene," the deputy said. "Horse likely spooked. These things happen." "Thomas rode that trail for 11 years, she said. "In the dark, in the rain, in the snow." The deputy picked up his hat from the table. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm sorry for your loss." That was the end of the official inquiry into the death of Thomas Mercer. She stood at his grave with $43 in the household account, a ranch mortgage that came due in 6 weeks, and 2 ranch hands who were already shuffling their feet and avoiding her eyes. She understood what that meant. Men who worked for a widow in this territory were men who expected to find new employment soon. What they didn't understand, what almost no one understood about Evelyn Mercer, was that she had not spent 11 years building that ranch alongside her husband to walk away from it because the mathematics of survival looked ugly. She threw the dirt. She went back to work. The Mercer Ranch sat on 420 acres of mixed grassland and timber country in the northern part of the territory, bordered on the east by a creek that had never run dry in the 11 years they'd owned the land. Thomas had picked the property himself, had seen something in the shape of the hills and the angle of the water table that other buyers had missed. He had been right about almost everything. The land was good. The grass was deep. The cattle they ran were healthy, and the small horse operation Evelyn had built on the south pasture had become the quieter, steadier income when beef prices softened. She knew the ranch the way she knew her own hands, every fence post, every water hole, every stretch of fence that needed patching before winter. She knew which of their 3 wells ran slow in August and which one you could depend on regardless of drought. She had doctored cattle in weather that would keep a sensible person indoors. She had once spent 3 days alone in a line cabin during a February storm that killed 7 horses on the neighboring property. She was not, in other words, a woman who needed rescuing. But the first month after Thomas died made her understand something she hadn't fully reckoned with, that what she'd built with her husband had been a 2-person machine, and running it alone at half capacity was not the same as running it at all. The 2 remaining hands quit inside of 3 weeks. One of them, a decent enough young man named Curtis, at least had the decency to look ashamed about it. "It's not about you, ma'am," he said. "I know whose decision it is," she said. He left the next morning. She hired replacements through a labor broker in Casper, 2 older men who came with decent references and left without explanation inside of 2 months. When she rode into town to ask about new hands, she started noticing something. Men she'd known for years were suddenly busy with their eyes when she came into the feed store. The banker, a thin man named Prescott, who had always been professionally cordial, started taking longer to return her inquiries about the note extension she'd requested. It took her a while to understand what she was looking at. Garrett Hollow's land bordered hers on the north and west. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, owned 2 saloons in town, and had a handshake arrangement with enough local officials that his handshake was, in practical terms, indistinguishable from law. He was not an obvious villain. He didn't shout or threaten or wave guns around. He was patient. He was methodical. He had a way of making the pressure he applied feel like bad weather rather than intention. The first thing she could actually prove was the water. In late spring, the East Creek slowed to a thin trickle. By July, it had stopped entirely. She rode her fence line until she found where Hollow's men had diverted the upper channel with a crude earthwork dam 2 miles north of her property line, technically on public grazing land, positioned precisely where no one would think to look unless they already suspected. She rode to the county land office. The clerk, a soft-faced man named Addison, who she'd never had trouble with before, took her complaint and told her he'd look into it. She came back 2 weeks later and he told her the file had been misfiled and he was still looking. She came back a third time and he told her the diversion had been assessed and determined to be within allowable use rights. She stood at his counter for a long moment. "Who assessed it?" she asked. He looked at the wall behind her when he answered. "County engineer." "The county engineer works for Garrett Hollow's brother-in-law," she said. Addison straightened his papers. "Mrs. Mercer, I don't think that's—" "I'm not asking what you think," she said. "I'm telling you what's true." She left and drove her wagon back to the ranch in the kind of anger that doesn't shake your hands. It goes cold and sits in your chest like iron weight. That night, she started a ledger. Not a financial ledger. A different kind. She wrote down the date, the creek, the clerk's name, and what he'd said. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but she wrote it down. That was her nature. Thomas used to say Evelyn never threw anything away that might prove useful later. The summer was hard in every way a summer could be hard. She sold off a portion of her horse stock to cover the loan extension Prescott finally granted, at a higher interest rate than her original note, which she was fairly certain wasn't a coincidence. She hired a single hand, a grizzled man of about 60 named Hector, who had worked ranches across 3 territories and came recommended by a woman in town that Evelyn trusted. Hector was slow-moving, competent, and entirely uninterested in whatever local politics surrounded the Mercer property. "You're fighting a man who owns the referees," he said to her one evening, not unkindly. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" "Keep records, keep working, wait for a mistake." Hector thought about that. Men like Hollow don't make many mistakes. "Well, every man makes mistakes," she said. "They just make different kinds." He had no answer to that and went back to oiling his saddle. She went back inside and added 3 more entries to her ledger. The autumn came, and with it a new problem. 2 of the water holes on the south pasture had been salted. She didn't discover it until she lost a horse and nearly lost 2 others and had to call in the county veterinarian at her own cost. He confirmed it quietly, wouldn't put it in writing, and charged her for the visit with the look of a man who'd been told in advance not to make official reports about anything connected to that particular property. She buried the horse herself. Hector helped her. Neither of them said much. It was somewhere in that dark autumn that Evelyn Mercer stopped simply being angry and arrived at something harder and quieter, a kind of bedrock refusal that went beyond stubbornness. This was not, she understood now, a matter of whether she could run a ranch alone. This was a matter of whether she would allow a man who almost certainly had something to do with her husband's death to profit from that death by taking the land Thomas had died on. She would not. The decision didn't make things easier. It didn't make the money problem smaller, or the loneliness lighter, or the winter any less brutal. But it made her clearer. She knew what she was doing and why she was doing it, and that was not a small thing. By December she had Hector, her ledger, and $43, exactly the same as when she'd started, which she took as a kind of dark joke the universe was making. The night Silas Kane came through her gate, it was past 10 o'clock and the moon was nowhere. She had been awake because she was almost always awake at that hour. She did her accounting at night when the ranch was quiet, or tried to, which mostly meant sitting at the kitchen table staring at numbers that didn't add up, while the wood stove ticked itself down to coals. She heard the horse first. A single animal moving wrong, lurching, stopping, lurching again. She recognized the rhythm before she understood it, a horse carrying dead weight. She took the rifle down from the wall and went to the porch. In the dark, she could make out the shape of a horse standing just inside her gate, blowing hard. Its head dropped. There was something across its back that she took at first for a rolled blanket or saddlebag. It moved. "Hello?" Her voice was flat and loud enough to carry. "Whoever you are, I have a rifle and I know how to use it." No answer. The horse shifted, and the something across its back slid sideways, and she saw then that it was a man barely clinging to the saddle, his left arm hanging at an angle that wasn't right. She stood on the porch for a moment, rifle still up, thinking. This was the kind of situation Thomas would have walked into without hesitation. That was one of the things she'd loved and worried about in equal measure. His instinct toward other people's trouble. She was not made the same way. She was not cold, but she was careful. A wounded stranger at her gate at 10 at night in the middle of winter, with Garrett Hollow running a systematic campaign to ruin her, this was not a moment for carelessness. But the man was barely on the horse, and the temperature had dropped below freezing 2 hours ago. She made a decision the same way she made most of her decisions, not with comfort, but with a clear accounting of what she could live with. "Can you hear me?" she called, a sound that might have been yes. "If I come out there, you're going to tell me your name and who shot you. Understood?" A longer pause, then, "Understood." She went in, put on her coat and boots, came back out with the rifle and a lantern, and walked across the yard. He was in worse shape than she'd thought. The wound was in his left shoulder, high up, and it had been bleeding for a while. His shirt and jacket were soaked dark, and he'd tied something around his upper arm that had slowed it but not stopped it. His face, in the lantern light, was gray and sheened with sweat despite the cold. He looked at her with eyes that were working very hard to stay focused and not entirely succeeding. "Name," she said. "Silas." A pause, shallow breath. "Silas Kane." "Who shot you?" "Hollow's men." Another pause. "3 of them. I got one. The other 2... He stopped, swallowed. "I need to get off this horse." "I know you do." She studied him another moment. "You know Garrett Hollow?" His eyes sharpened fractionally. "Know of him. I was..." He stopped again, and this time it wasn't pain stopping him. It was something more deliberate. "I was passing through, camped on the South Range. They came while I was asleep." She didn't believe the story. She also didn't have time to press it with a man bleeding in her yard at 10 degrees. "I'm going to help you down," she said. "Don't fight me." He didn't fight her, but he also didn't have much to offer. He was operating on pure stubbornness by that point, she could tell. She got him off the horse and got his good arm across her shoulders, and got him across the yard and up the porch steps, which took longer than it should have and required her to stop twice because he nearly went down. She was a strong woman, not unusually tall, but 11 years of ranch work had put a kind of practical, undeniable strength in her arms and back, and she managed. She got him to the kitchen, got him into a chair, and told him not to move while she went to get supplies. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. It came out with a kind of dry humor that surprised her. Surprised him too, she thought, from the expression that crossed his face immediately after. She worked on his shoulder without conversation. The bullet had gone through cleanly, which was either luck or skill depending on the angle of the shot, and she said so. "Luck," he said. "I was already falling when he fired." She packed the wound with clean cloth, added a folded bandage over that, and began wrapping it tight. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. She could tell by how he held himself, not rigidly, not dramatically, but with a practical stillness that came from familiarity with pain rather than bravery about it. He didn't answer. "I'm not asking who you are," she said. "Tonight, I'm saying you've been shot before and you know how to be shot, and that's not something most drifters know." A pause. Fair observation. "Were you followed?" He thought about it. "I don't think so. I rode the creek bed for 6 miles, came west instead of south." He looked at her directly for the first time. "I didn't plan to stop here. The horse decided." "Good horse." "She's a very good horse," he agreed. And there was something in his voice when he said it, something that wasn't armor, that made Evelyn look at him differently, just for a moment. She finished the wrapping, washed her hands, and stood back. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight," she said. "I'll put your horse in the barn. Tomorrow, when you can stand up straight, You'll tell me the truth about what happened." He met her eyes. He had gray eyes, she noticed, the kind that looked like they were always calculating something but doing it quietly. "You're taking a risk." "I've been taking risks for 18 months, she said. "One more isn't going to break me." She turned away to get him a glass of water and found herself thinking of Thomas, of the way Thomas had always said that the worst thing you could do was let fear make your decisions for you. He'd meant it about ranching, about cattle prices and weather risk and bank loans. She was fairly certain he'd also meant it about people. She set the water on the table. Silas Kane drank it slowly, both hands around the glass, and looked around her kitchen with the careful, cataloging attention of a man who was used to knowing where things were. She noticed that too. She noticed it, added it to her mental ledger, and went to bed. In the morning, he was still there, which she hadn't been entirely certain of, and he was standing at her window watching the north pasture with his good arm crossed over his bad one, and an expression she recognized without being able to name it. It was the expression of someone counting things. "How long has the fence been down on the north line?" he asked without turning around. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Good morning." "Good morning." "The fence..." "2 weeks. Hollow's men ride that line. They have a habit of cutting wire and calling it cattle damage." He turned then. He looked better than the night before in the way that a man who was previously on the edge of death looks when he has moved back a few steps from it, still pale, still careful about his left side, but present. Awake. Something in his face was working. "You're keeping records," he said. It wasn't a question any more than her comment about his being shot had been. She walked to the stove and started the coffee. "What makes you say that?" "The ledger on the table. The way you answered when I mentioned Hollow's men. No surprise, just confirmation. You've been building a file." She didn't answer for a moment. The coffee started. She turned and looked at him squarely. "You said you were a drifter passing through," she said. "I did." "Drifters passing through don't ask about fence lines first thing in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in him. She saw it. A kind of internal calibration, like a man deciding how many cards to show. "I used to look for patterns," he said finally. "Old habit." "What kind of patterns?" "The kind that look like bad luck until you see enough of them together." She poured 2 cups and set one on the table for him. He came and sat down, moving carefully, and wrapped his hands around the cup the same way he had around the water glass the night before. "The creek that went dry," he said. "That would be east of the property." "Yes." "And before that, workers quit. Loan terms changed." "Yes." "Salted water holes?" She looked at him sharply. "How do you know about that?" "I don't. I'm asking." He held her gaze. "But if they did, that's the next step. After they cut the water and the credit." She was quiet for a moment. 2 horses. I lost one." He nodded, slow, not surprised. She watched his face and found that she was, in spite of everything, not afraid of him. She was something closer to the opposite of afraid, which was its own kind of unsettling. "Your husband," he said carefully. "Don't." He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "I don't know you yet." He accepted that without argument, picked up his coffee. "Fair enough." Hector arrived at 7:30 to start morning chores and found a strange man at the kitchen table with his arm in a sling and the widow of Thomas Mercer sitting across from him looking, for the first time in many months, like a woman who was thinking about something other than survival. Hector stood in the doorway for a moment. "This is Silas," Evelyn said. "He needs somewhere to be for a few days." Hector looked at Silas. Silas looked back. "Can you work?" Hector asked. "One-handed, probably." "Then you earn your keep." Hector hung his coat on the peg by the door and picked up his coffee mug. "We've got 4 miles of fence that needs checking and a water trough that's gone dry on the south end." "I'll start with the fence," Silas said. "I want to see the property lines." Evelyn watched Hector's eyebrows move very slightly, the way old rangemen's eyebrows do when they've heard something unexpected from someone they'd already sized up. She went back to her coffee. Outside, the wind was coming up from the north, and the sky had the particular white-gray look of weather building. There was trouble coming. There had been trouble coming for 18 months. But sitting at her kitchen table that morning, Evelyn Mercer felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was not entirely alone in facing it. She was not comforted by that exactly. She was something harder to name. She was ready. Silas stayed 3 days before Evelyn stopped expecting him to leave. He didn't announce his intention to remain. He simply kept working. On the second morning, he was already outside when she came down, moving along the east fence line with a roll of wire across his good shoulder and a pair of pliers in his hand, doing what Hector would have needed a full day to finish alone. He worked quietly, without commentary, and he was thorough in the particular way of someone who had learned early that a job done halfway was worse than a job not started. On the third morning, she found him in the barn before first light, crouched beside the south water trough with a lantern held low, studying something in the dirt around the base. "Trough's not dry," he said without looking up. "The feed line's been blocked. Something pushed into the pipe from outside." She crouched beside him. In the lantern light, she could see it. A plug of rags and packed clay jammed into the intake pipe, where it ran along the barn's foundation wall. "When?" she asked. "Recently. Clay's still damp." She stood up and looked at the barn door. It wasn't forced. It had been opened with knowledge of how the latch worked, a particular lift and twist motion that wasn't obvious unless you'd seen it done. "Someone's been on this property," she said. "Yes." "At night." "Most likely." He pulled the plug free and the water started moving again, thin at first, then stronger. "They're not done, Evelyn. Whatever they did with the creek and the loans and the workers, this is still active." She heard him use her first name and didn't comment on it. At some point in the past 3 days, it had stopped being presumptuous and started being accurate. "I know they're not done," she said. He looked at her then, over his shoulder, with those gray eyes doing their quiet accounting. "You're not scared?" "I'm scared all the time," she said flatly. "I just don't let it run the operation." He turned back to the trough, adjusting the flow. "Thomas built this barn." It wasn't a question. She didn't ask how he knew. "He built most of it," she said. "We built the loft together. It took 3 weeks because neither of us had done it before, and we argued about the angle of the crossbeams for 4 days. Who won?" "I did. The beams are fine." She picked up the lantern. "Come have breakfast." That was how it settled, not through conversation or agreement or anything as formal as a decision, just through the accumulation of mornings, the same way most of the important things in her life had been decided. She had not hired him. He had not asked to stay. But by the end of that first week, the ranch ran differently. Not better exactly, not yet, but with a kind of doubled attention that had been missing since Thomas died. Hector noticed it without remarking on it, which was his way of approving. Silas was useful with his hands. That much was immediately clear. He could repair a fence post, reshoe a horse, reseat a saddle tree, and read weather by the feel of the morning air with the accuracy of someone who had spent serious time outdoors. What he could not do, for the first 2 weeks, was use his left arm for anything requiring force. He compensated without complaint, switching tasks, finding angles that didn't require the shoulder. And Evelyn respected that more than she would have respected any show of toughness about it. But it was the other things she noticed. The way he remembered conversations verbatim. She would mention something casually at breakfast, a comment made by the feed store clerk, a detail about the loan paperwork, and 3 days later he would bring it back with the precision of a man who had filed it away in an organized room inside his head. The way he looked at a map. She had a property survey pinned to the wall in Thomas's old office, and she found Silas standing in front of it one afternoon, not studying the Mercer land, but studying the borders. Hollows ranged to the north, the county road to the east, the creek's original path marked in Thomas's handwriting. "Where did the water go?" he asked. "When they diverted the creek?" "North, toward Hollow's south pasture." "How much pasture?" "Maybe 800 acres of dry ground that wouldn't support cattle without the water." He was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing something she couldn't see on the map. "And the railroad survey line, is this accurate?" She looked at the map. Thomas had drawn a dotted line in pencil across the eastern section of their property, a survey he'd obtained from the Territorial Land Office the year before he died. "As far as we know, the Territorial Railroad Commission ran it 2 years ago." Silas stepped back. His expression was the same one he'd been wearing in her barn, focused, internal, not quite present in the room. What are you looking at? She asked. The reason, he said. The reason for what? The reason a man like Hollow needs this particular 420 acres. He turned to face her. He's not running short on grazing land. He's got more cattle range than he can use. So why does he want yours so badly that he's willing to divert a creek and salt water holes and manipulate a bank? She had thought about this. She had thought about it through many sleepless nights, and she had arrived at the same conclusion she suspected Silas was arriving at now. The railroad, she said. The railroad, he agreed. When that line gets built, whoever owns the land along this corridor gets a depot, gets a loading facility, gets a freight connection to every market in the territory and half the country beyond it. He looked back at the map. Your 420 acres is not a ranch to Garrett Hollow. It's a commercial opportunity worth 10 times what he's been offering you. She had known this, in a general way. Hearing it laid out with such clean certainty by someone who was clearly used to laying things out did something specific to the quality of her anger, refined it the way you refine raw metal, burning off everything that wasn't essential. He killed Thomas for a freight depot, she said. Silas went still. She hadn't meant to say that. She had kept those words inside for 18 months, behind every other sentence she'd spoken, and they had come out not in a moment of grief, but in a moment of cold clarity. I don't know that, Silas said carefully. I do. A silence. You can't prove it, he said. Not yet. Not yet, she agreed. He looked at her for a long time. She met his eyes without flinching and without any expectation that he would offer her comfort, because she wasn't asking for it. Tell me about the night he died, he said finally. She told him. She had not told anyone. Not fully, not every detail. She told Silas, standing in Thomas's office in front of Thomas's map, all of it. The evening before, when Thomas had come in from the North Range looking disturbed and saying almost nothing about why. The way he'd gotten up in the middle of the night. The horse gone in this morning, 2 days of searching before someone found him. He didn't tell you what he'd seen, Silas said. No, he was protecting me from something. That's... He stopped, started again. That's a very specific kind of silence, when a person doesn't tell you something because they don't want you involved. I know. He may have seen something on that North Range, something to do with the water diversion or the survey or a meeting he wasn't supposed to see, Evelyn said, or a document or a conversation. She folded her arms. I've had 18 months to think about what Thomas might have stumbled onto. Silas was quiet again. Then, we need more than a theory. She noticed the we without comment, the same way she'd noticed her first name. I know, she said. I've been building records. I have dates, incidents, names of clerks who turned away complaints, but it's all circumstantial individually. Can I see the ledger? She went and got it. He sat at Thomas's desk and read through it with the concentrated attention of a man reading a legal document, not moving, not asking questions, occasionally going back to reread something. She stood in the doorway and watched him. The afternoon light came through the office window and lay across the desk in a flat yellow rectangle. When he finished, he looked up. You've got something real here. It's not enough. Not yet, but you've documented the pattern. He looked back at the ledger. Most people don't do that. They fight each incident separately and lose each one separately. You've been treating it like a system. It is a system. Yes. He closed the ledger and set it on the desk with the precision of a man returning something valuable. We need the banking records, the actual loan documents, not just your copies, the originals, the internal communications, and we need to know who else Hollow has done this to. There was a family named Prater, she said, southeast of here, about 4 years ago. They sold and left. I always thought, names of the officers at the bank who handled the Prater loan? She stared at him. How would I know that? You might not, but someone in town would. He looked at her steadily. You said the clerk at the land office told you the county engineer had assessed the creek diversion. What's the engineer's name? Dolan? Walt Dolan. And Dolan is Hollow's brother-in-law. Married to Hollow's wife's sister, yes. Is Dolan still in the position? As far as I know. Silas stood up carefully, with the slightly reduced range of motion in his left side that he'd probably carry for a while yet. The whole system depends on controlling the official record. The bank, the land office, the county engineer. If we can find a record that contradicts what the official record says, anything outside Hollow's reach, that's where it starts to unravel. You make it sound straightforward, she said. It's not. He said it without apology. It's going to take time, and it's going to require somebody in that town to be willing to say what they know. That's the hardest part. People who've been watching Hollow operate for years have learned that cooperation doesn't pay. I know people, she said. Who? Margaret Holt. She runs the dry goods store. Her husband did the freight hauling for half the ranches in the county before he died, including the Prater place. She knows where every penny moved in this county for 20 years. Something shifted in Silas's expression, a small, quick recalibration. Is she someone who talks? To the right person about the right things? Evelyn paused. I'll need to go see her alone. He considered that. All right. It was, she realized, not actually his call to make, and he knew it. The fact that he'd said all right rather than something about caution or being careful meant he understood the same thing. She rode into town 3 days later. Hector and Silas were mending the southeast fence, which had been cut again. A clean cut, wire snips, someone who hadn't bothered to make it look accidental this time. The town of Dunbar was not large. 2 streets of commercial buildings, a rail freight office, a saloon, the bank, the land office, and several smaller operations that served the surrounding ranch community. Evelyn had been coming to Dunbar her entire married life. She knew which floorboards creaked in which shops and where every family stood in relation to every other family, and which information traveled fast and which traveled slow. She tied her horse in front of the dry goods store and went in. Margaret Holt was 63 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had outlasted several people who had underestimated her. She was behind the counter when Evelyn came in, measuring out coffee from a large tin, and she looked up with an expression that didn't quite conceal relief. I was wondering when you'd come, Margaret said. Evelyn pulled the door closed behind her. The store was empty of other customers. You knew I would? I figured sooner or later. Margaret set down the coffee tin and came around the counter. How's the shoulder on that man you've got working for you? Evelyn went still. How do you know about that? Because 3 of Hollow's men were in here the day after he showed up at your place, asking if anyone had seen a man come through town with a fresh wound. Margaret kept her voice level. I said no, which was true. He didn't come through town, did he? He came the back way. You covered for him. I covered for you, Margaret said. There's a difference. She moved to the window and looked out at the street, a quick checking glance. Sit down, Evelyn. They sat in the 2 chairs Margaret kept at the back of the store for long conversations with regular customers, which was a thing dry goods proprietors had always done and which Evelyn had always liked about her. Tell me about the Prater family, Evelyn said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, Webb Prater had the same bank loan, same officer, man named Delacroix at First Territorial. His creek dried up too 2 years before yours, different method. They blocked it upstream, on county land, same as yours. Webb complained twice, and then one night his barn burned. She paused. He sold inside of 6 months. To Hollow. Through a land company. Territorial Land Associates. But yes, Hollow. The company's filed in Cheyenne, but the principal is a man named Rudd, and Rudd and Hollow have done business together for... She stopped. You need to understand, Evelyn, I watched this happen to the Praters. I watched them leave with almost nothing. I should have said something then, and I didn't. Why are you saying something now? Margaret looked at her with a directness that Evelyn recognized as the kind that cost something. Because you haven't left yet. And because I think if you leave, there's nobody after you. She paused. And because I'm tired of watching that man own everything. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I need the name of the bank officer who handled the Prater loan, and I need to know if there's any original documentation anywhere outside of Delacroix's files. Margaret looked at her carefully. You're not asking random questions. No. Someone's helping you think through this. Someone with particular experience, Evelyn said. She didn't offer more and Margaret didn't press. The Praters took their copies, Margaret said when they left. Webb was angry enough to keep his paperwork even when everything else seemed pointless. Last I heard, his daughter is living in Laramie. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small card. I wrote her address down 6 months ago. I'd been wondering if someone would come ask for it. Evelyn took the card. It was worn at the edges, like it had been handled more than once. You've been waiting, Evelyn said. I've been hoping, Margaret said. Different thing. Evelyn rode back to the ranch with the card in her coat pocket, and 2 hours of thought working through her while the horse made its steady way along the frozen road. She went over everything Margaret had told her, pressing on each piece the way you press a joint to find where it's weak. When she got home, she found Silas on the porch, sitting with his back against the post, looking north. Hollow's man came by, he said. She stopped at the foot of the steps. Which one? The foreman, Briggs. He came to the gate, didn't come in. Asked Hector if the widow was taking on hired hands permanent now. He said it without inflection, but she heard the shape of what it meant. He knows you're here. He knows I'm here. And he'll tell Hollow, and Hollow will want to know who I am. He looked at her finally. That's going to be a problem. Are you worried? A pause. Not the kind of pause that means yes, but the kind that means the question is more complicated than it looks. I'm careful, he said. There's a difference. She sat down on the top step. Margaret Holt knows something happened to you. She covered for you when Hollow's men came asking. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She gave me the address of the Prater daughter in Laramie, Evelyn said. Their family kept copies of their loan documents. If the terms were manipulated the same way mine were, we have a pattern that exists outside of anything Hollow controls. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Laramie is 3 days' ride. I know. You can't go alone. I know that too. He looked at the north range. The light was going now, the sky doing its slow winter collapse toward dark. I can write to someone in Laramie, someone who can go to the Prater woman and get copies of whatever she has. Who? He didn't answer immediately. Silas? Someone I worked with before. He said it carefully, the way he said anything that touched whatever it was he wasn't telling her. Someone I trust. She let that sit. Before what? He looked at her, that accountant's gaze always measuring something. Before I was passing through Wyoming, he said. It was the most he'd given her. She didn't push. Write the letter, she said. He wrote it that night at Thomas's desk by lamplight. She didn't read it over his shoulder. She made supper and they ate at the kitchen table with Hector, and the conversation covered ordinary things. Weather, a horse that needed its shoes checked, the price of hay. While underneath all of it, Evelyn was aware of Silas's letter sitting folded on the desk in the other room, like a door she hadn't opened yet. The letter went out with the stagecoach 3 days later. 2 weeks after that, Hollow's second move arrived. The notice from First Territorial Bank came by mail, which was itself unusual. Prescott normally delivered anything significant in person, a habit of small-town banking that served the additional purpose of allowing him to observe how the recipient received bad news. The written notice meant he didn't want to be in the room for this one. The note was being called. Not extended, not renegotiated. Called. Full payment of the outstanding balance due in 60 days. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and set it down flat and sat with her hands on her knees for a while. Hector came in from outside and saw her face and poured himself coffee without asking what had happened. He would wait. That was Hector's particular quality, an old man's understanding that some news required a moment before it required a response. Silas came in 20 minutes later, read the notice where it lay on the table, and pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. How much? He asked. She told him. He was quiet. What do you have on hand? She told him that too. The gap between those two numbers was very large. 60 days, he said. Yes. That's deliberate timing, Silas said. After winter, before spring work starts, when you'd need capital, when selling cattle gets you the worst price. I know. He's squeezing the calendar. I know, Silas. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. There's a federal land office in Cheyenne, not the county office, the territorial one. If the Prater documents show what Margaret Holt thinks they show, and if we can put together what you have in your ledger with anything from Laramie, 60 days is not enough time, she said. Not to get documents from Laramie, build a case, travel to Cheyenne, and find someone in the territorial office willing to act on it. Maybe not, he said, but it's enough time to make enough noise that a foreclosure starts looking complicated for Hollow. He owns the local complications. He owns the local ones, Silas said. He doesn't own Cheyenne. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw, which was not bravado. She had already learned the difference with him, but something more structural, like a load-bearing wall. How do you know what he owns and doesn't own? She asked. You've been here 6 weeks. The pause again, the measuring pause. I don't know for certain, he said, but a man who operates the way Hollow operates builds his power locally first. The county clerk, the county engineer, the local bank officer, those are his tools. Territorial authorities are harder to own. They're appointed, not elected. They answer to people in Washington. That's a very specific kind of analysis, Evelyn said. I told you I look for patterns. You told me you used to, she said. You told me it was an old habit. The lamp between them threw its unsteady light across the table. Silas set down his coffee. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I wasn't a drifter, he said. Before. I know. He stopped. The word for whatever he was seemed to resist being said. I worked for the federal government, investigating crimes, land fraud, rail corruption, financial manipulation, for 8 years. She waited. 18 months ago I stopped, he said. A partner of mine was killed. The people who killed him were connected to people higher than I could reach. And when I went to my supervisors, he exhaled. It was suggested very clearly that the investigation should close. And instead you left. Instead I left, he said, because staying meant either going silent or going into the ground next to my partner. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up again, rattling the window in its frame. Does the name Silas Kane belong to you? She asked. A small, thin pause. It belongs to me enough. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him for a long time. At the man across her kitchen table who had come bleeding through her gate and fixed her fences and read her ledger and eaten her meals and written his careful letter to someone from a life he'd sealed off, and who was sitting now with the truth finally on the surface between them, like something excavated. Does anyone know where you are? She asked. If they do, he said slowly, they haven't come looking. But you're not sure. I'm never sure. She folded the bank notice and put it in her apron pocket. She stood up. Then I guess we'd better move fast, she said. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, but something in the same direction. Something that cost him to feel. Evelyn, he said, if I help you fight this, if I start making noise and pulling at Hollow's threads, people may start asking questions about the man helping you. I know. If the wrong people find out where I am, then you'll deal with it when it happens, she said, the same way I deal with things when they happen. He stared at her. This is my ranch, she said, not unkindly. Thomas died for it. I'm not going to let it go to satisfy a man's greed while I'm standing here with 2 working legs and a ledger full of evidence. She picked up the lamp to take it to the other room. Write another letter, this one to whoever you trust at the territorial office in Cheyenne. Don't tell them your name if you don't want to. Tell them what we have and what we're looking for. She paused in the doorway. And Silas. She looked back at him. Whatever name is on your birth certificate doesn't matter to me. What matters is whether you're going to help me or not. He looked at her the way Thomas had once looked at her across a table on a night when everything was going wrong and she'd said the one thing that cut through it. I'm going to help you, he said. Good. She took the lamp. Then get some sleep. We've got a lot of work to do. Hector, who had been sitting with his coffee on the far side of the room and apparently examining the grain of the table very carefully for the past 20 minutes, cleared his throat. I'll second that, he said. About the sleep. Nobody laughed, but the temperature in the room changed slightly. Outside, the wind pressed at the walls, and the night was very dark, and the North Range held its frozen silence like something waiting. 60 days. It wasn't enough. It might just have to be. The letter from Laramie arrived on a Tuesday, 17 days after Silas had sent his. Evelyn was in the barn when Hector brought it from the mailbox at the road, and she knew from the way he walked, not hurrying but purposeful, that it was something. She came out to meet him, wiping her hands on her work pants, and took the envelope without speaking. The return address was a rooming house on Fletcher Street in Laramie. The handwriting on the outside was a woman's, careful, compressed, the kind of script that came from someone who'd been taught that penmanship mattered and had kept believing it past the age when most people stopped. She brought it inside and called for Silas. He came from the office where he'd been working. He'd been spending his mornings in there, at Thomas's desk, going through everything she had, building something she couldn't yet see the full shape of. He read the return address, then looked at her with a question in his expression. She handed it to him. He opened it, read it standing up, then read it again. Then he set it on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with his palm. Clara Prater, he said. Webb's daughter. She has the documents. All of them? Everything her father kept. She says... He looked at the letter again. She says her father told her before he died that the loan terms were changed after he signed, that his copies show different repayment conditions than what the bank later claimed. Evelyn sat down. The weight of that was specific. Not the weight of something new, but the weight of something she had suspected confirmed, which was its own kind of heavy. They changed the paperwork after the fact, she said. That's what it looks like. Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which means Delacroix at the bank didn't just set unfavorable terms. He altered documents after a borrower signed. That's not predatory lending. That's fraud. Federal fraud, because First Territorial operates under a territorial charter, which puts it under federal banking jurisdiction. She looked at him. He was using the language of his previous life without seeming to notice, the clean, precise taxonomy of someone who had spent years putting names to crimes. The contact you wrote to, she said. In Cheyenne. Did they write back? A pause. Not yet. How long? I don't know. He said it with a flatness that meant he was worried about it and didn't want to say so. My contact, I didn't know, when I wrote, whether they were still in the position they were in. Things may have changed. Or they may have decided not to get involved. That too, he said. Yes. She nodded. It was an honest answer. She had learned that Silas's honest answers sometimes felt like small impacts. Not cruel, but solid. Thomas had been the same way. She'd liked it in Thomas, and she found she didn't mind it in Silas either, which told her something she wasn't quite ready to look at directly. What do we do about Clara Prater? She asked. Someone needs to go to Laramie. He said it the way he said things when he'd already worked through the implications and didn't love what he'd found. Get the original documents or certified copies. Bring them back here. Then we have something physical, something outside Hollow's filing system. You can't go, she said. Not a challenge, just arithmetic. No. His jaw tightened slightly. If Hollow's man is already asking about me in town, a 3-day ride to Laramie and back is too exposed. Someone who knows my face could... He stopped. No, I can't go. I can go, she said. Evelyn, I've ridden to Laramie before. Thomas and I went twice for stock sales. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you my plan. He looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was deciding how much of his concern was legitimate and how much of it was the reflexive protectiveness of a man who had watched someone he was close to get killed and was now applying that fear to every situation involving danger and anyone he... She cut off that line of thought. If Briggs or any of Hollow's men follow me, they'll see a widow making a business trip, she said. Nothing unusual about that. But if you go, and they recognize you from whatever description they're working from, we lose everything. It was quiet for a long moment. She could see him moving through it. Take Hector, he finally said. Hector's 60 years old. Hector's also a man who has ridden more dangerous miles than either of us and arrived at 60 because he's careful, Silas said. Take him, please. She looked at him. The please was not something he deployed casually. She had already understood that about him. All right, she said. I'll take Hector. They left 2 days later, at first light, while Silas stood at the gate watching them go with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was keeping something off his face. Evelyn didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd made a practice in the past 18 months of not looking back at things she'd already decided. The ride to Laramie was cold and uneventful. Hector was the best kind of traveling companion, which was the kind that didn't require constant conversation. They rode and talked when there was something worth saying and were quiet when there wasn't, and they made good time on roads that were frozen hard enough to give the horses solid footing. Clara Prater was 31 years old, dark-haired, and had the wary, assessing eyes of someone who had been through a family catastrophe and come out the other side of it functional, but not unscathed. She received Evelyn in the front room of the rooming house with a formality that broke down inside of 20 minutes. They told my father the bank made a paperwork error, she said, after he'd already signed the original. They brought him a corrected version and told him to sign again, and he was so worried about the barn burning and the cattle and my mother being sick that he signed it. She looked at her hands. He knew something was wrong. He kept the first copy. He never told me why until he was dying. What did he say? Evelyn asked. He said, keep it. Keep all of it. He said someday someone else is going to need to see what was done to us. She went to the bureau in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer and came back with a flat package wrapped in oilcloth. I've had this for 2 years waiting for someone to come. Evelyn unwrapped the package carefully. Inside were 3 documents: the original loan agreement with Webb Prater's signature and a date, a second document dated 6 weeks later that was clearly meant to supersede the first, but which altered the repayment schedule in 4 specific places, and a letter from the bank officer named Delacroix that referenced the second document as a correction, but used language that made it sound routine. She held the original and the replacement side by side and looked at what had been changed. The repayment window shortened. The penalty clause for default expanded. The collateral clause, and this was the one that made her jaw tighten, had been rewritten so that in the event of default, the bank could seize not just the property, but all assets, including livestock and improvements, at a value to be assessed by a county appraiser rather than at market rate. County appraiser. Who would be appointed by county officials? Who answered to whom? The appraiser, she said to Clara. Do you know who assessed your father's property when the bank moved to foreclose? Clara's expression was already answering. A man named Dolan. Walt Dolan, Hollow's brother-in-law. They were home in 2.5 days, making better time on the return because the temperature had dropped and the roads were even harder. Silas met them at the gate again. He looked at the oilcloth package under Evelyn's arm, then at her face, and she gave him one small nod. He exhaled. She saw his shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. They spread the Prater documents on the kitchen table alongside Evelyn's ledger and the copies of her own loan paperwork from First Territorial, and for the next 4 hours they worked. Silas moved between the documents with a focused efficiency that was almost uncomfortable to watch. Not because it was cold, but because it was so clearly the expression of a trained mind doing work it had been built to do, which meant watching him was watching someone who had tried to stop being himself and hadn't entirely succeeded. Same appraiser clause, he said, pointing to Evelyn's documents and then to the Praters. Same language, almost verbatim. Same bank officer? Different name on Evelyn's, Prescott, not Delacroix. But Prescott is Delacroix's subordinate. I found that in the corporate registration documents for First Territorial that Margaret got us. He moved to another sheet. The water diversion in the Prater case was a different method, but the sequence is identical. Water issue first, then labor disruption, then loan called early. He stood back and looked at the assembled papers. This is a procedure, not a series of coincidences. It's a documented procedure. Can we prove it was coordinated? Evelyn asked. Not yet. He said it with the careful specificity of someone who meant not yet literally. But the existence of the same method applied to 2 adjacent properties, with the same county official as appraiser in both cases, and loans from the same institution. He looked up. No competent investigator would call that coincidence. We don't have a competent investigator, Evelyn said. We have you. Something passed through his expression at that. Almost, he said. The letter from Cheyenne arrived the following week. It was thin, one page, and it was not addressed to Silas Kane. It was addressed to a name Evelyn didn't recognize, and when she handed it to Silas, he looked at the name on the envelope for a moment before he opened it. He read it at the kitchen table, alone. She was in the other room and she did not come in. She heard nothing for a while, and then she heard the sound of a chair moving, and then silence again. When she came in 30 minutes later, the letter was on the table face down. Silas was standing at the window. Well, she said. He didn't turn. My contact is still in the position. He's willing to look at what we have. A pause. He wants to meet. In person. Cheyenne? Yes. When? He's suggesting 3 weeks. He turned now. His face was not upset but strained in a specific way. The strain of someone who has been avoiding a thing and has just been told they can't avoid it anymore. Meeting him means I have to go to Cheyenne, under my real name. The kitchen was very quiet. Tell me your real name, Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn, and the wind pressed at the north wall of the house. Connell? He said. James Connell. She repeated it, not out loud, just with her lips. It sounded true, not because names sound true or false, but because the way he said it had the particular weight of something that had been set down for a long time and just picked up again. James? She said. Most people called me Connell. I'll call you Silas until you tell me not to, she said. You haven't told me not to. Something in his face changed. Not the armor. That was more structural, she'd come to understand. Something underneath the armor. Going to Cheyenne means I surface, he said. Anyone who's been looking for James Connell for 18 months, if they have contacts in the territorial capital, they'll know. Do you think they've been looking for 18 months? He was quiet for a moment. Honestly? I don't know. I told myself they were. I've been telling myself that for long enough that I stopped being able to tell whether it was true or whether it was... He stopped. Whether it was just easier to keep running. It was the most unguarded thing he'd said to her. She treated it with the same careful respect she'd given to Webb Prater's documents. Not pressing, not making more of it than it was, just acknowledging the weight. If you go to Cheyenne and nothing happens, she said, then you'll know. And if something does happen, then we deal with it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that was not quite frustration and not quite helplessness and not quite something else. Evelyn, I want you to understand that if this goes wrong, if I surface and the people who killed my partner find out, it's not just me who becomes a target. Anyone connected to me? I know, she said. I'm serious. So am I. She looked at him steadily. When Thomas died, I had two choices. I could accept that this man's reach was longer than my ability to fight it and give up what Thomas died for. Or I could stay and fight and accept that staying and fighting carries risk. She paused. I made my choice 18 months ago. I'm not changing it now. He looked at her a long time. You would have been good at this work, he said finally. At what work? What I used to do. She almost smiled. I've never left Wyoming. Doesn't matter, he said. It's not about where you've been. It's about how you look at things. She put the kettle on. Write to your contact. Tell him we'll come to Cheyenne. He caught the we without commenting on it, but she saw it register. They told Hector that evening. He received the information about Silas's real identity with the complete absence of surprise that Evelyn was beginning to understand was Hector's version of tact. He asked one question. Are we going to have men with guns showing up here? Possibly, Silas said. Are they Hollow's men or somebody else's? I don't know yet. Hector drank his coffee. Well, he said, it'd be good to know which direction to watch. It would, Silas agreed. I'll watch both, Hector said, and that was the end of the conversation. The next 2 weeks moved in a particular way, dense with small events, each one adding to a structure that Silas was building with a methodical patience that reminded Evelyn of watching someone lay stone. He wrote to Clara Prater for a notarized affidavit, which she provided. He wrote to Margaret Holt for whatever documentary records she had about the freight patterns surrounding the Prater foreclosure, bills of lading, delivery records, anything that showed what had left that ranch in the weeks before and after the sale. Margaret came through with 6 years of freight ledgers that her late husband had kept and that she had stored in her cellar in 2 wooden boxes. "My husband was meticulous," she said when Evelyn picked them up. "He said a business that doesn't keep records deserves what happens to it." Evelyn looked at the boxes. He was right. He was about most things. Margaret looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who had been watching the world run badly for a long time and had something she needed to say. "Evelyn, what you're doing, going to Cheyenne, taking this to the territorial office, Hollow is going to know. Before you get back, he has people." "I know." "What he does when he knows, that's not going to be anything subtle." "I know that too." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Be careful what you leave behind when you go. He's burned a barn before." Evelyn looked at her. "He won't burn mine." "What makes you sure?" "Because the railroad survey corridor runs through my barn," she said. "He wants the land intact." She paused. "It's possibly the only thing that's kept this place standing." Margaret absorbed that. Then she nodded, once, and went inside. There was one evening, 9 days before they were set to leave for Cheyenne, when the machinery of preparation stopped for an hour. It was not planned. Evelyn came in from evening chores to find Silas at the kitchen table with Thomas's survey map spread in front of him, and instead of looking at property lines, he was looking at something in the lower corner of the map, a notation in Thomas's handwriting that Evelyn had long since memorized and never removed. She stood in the doorway and looked at his face, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do. "He drew stars in the margins," Silas said. "Why did he do that?" She came in and took off her coat. "He always did that, on any document that mattered to him. He said it was a habit from his father." She looked at the small penciled stars in the corners of the map. His father was an amateur astronomer. Thomas could name every visible star in both hemispheres. She sat down. "He used to take me out in the summer and show me. I could never remember the names. He'd show me the same ones every year, and every year I'd pretend it was the first time I was hearing them because he liked telling me." Silas was quiet. She hadn't intended to say all of that. "How long were you married?" he asked. 11 years. We had a daughter who died when she was 2. She said it flatly because 11 years of practice had made it flat. After that, we put everything into the ranch. It's not—" She stopped. "It was a choice. The work kept us from—" She stopped again. "From having to look at it too long," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the map still, at Thomas's stars. "My partner," he said. "We worked together for 6 years. He had a wife and 2 boys. A pause. "After he was killed, I went to tell her. She opened the door, and she already knew. She said she'd known the night before." He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't stay in that city after that. I couldn't look at his desk." She said nothing. It didn't require anything said. "When I came through your gate," he said, "I hadn't slept more than 3 hours in a stretch for about 4 months. I wasn't—" He exhaled. "I wasn't entirely sure I cared whether I made it to morning." The lamp between them held its small, steady fire. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her then, directly, without the calibration. "Now I care," he said. It was a simple sentence. It landed with the weight of something that had been held a long time before it was set down. She looked at the map, at Thomas's stars, at Silas's hands on the table, the left one still with a small movement limitation when he flexed it, which he did sometimes without noticing. "We should get sleep," she said. "We have a lot to do before Cheyenne." "We do," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Then he folded the map, carefully, along Thomas's original creases, and put it back where it had been. She got up and turned down the lamp. They said good night without ceremony and went to their separate rooms, and the house settled around them the way a house settles when the people in it have stopped pretending they don't know something true. The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days. They went together, Silas, Evelyn, and a locked box of documents that Silas had spent a week organizing into an order that would tell the clearest story in the least time. He had also written out, in a hand that was not the handwriting of Silas Kane, a 12-page summary of the pattern of fraud, organized by date and method and cross-referenced to each supporting document. She read it on the second night, at the table of a way station where they'd stopped. She read all 12 pages while Silas sat across from her eating something that didn't quite qualify as stew. "This is very good," she said. "It's adequate," he said. "It's better than adequate." She looked at him. "You were good at this." "I know." He said it without vanity and without false modesty, the plain statement of a man who had accepted a fact about himself. That was never the problem. What was the problem? He looked at his bowl. When you're good at finding what's wrong and the people above you tell you to stop finding it, that's when being good at the job stops being useful. She set down the summary. Who were the people above your supervisors? I don't know the whole chain. He pushed his bowl aside. Men with more money than Garrett Hollow. Men with interests in a very large railroad expansion project across 4 territories. He paused. My partner got a name. He told me he had a name and he was going to confirm it, and then he was dead inside of a week. Evelyn looked at him. Is this the same railroad? She asked. The same expansion? I don't know. He said it clearly, deliberately. I don't know if Hollow is connected to the larger network or if he's just a local opportunist who saw an opportunity in the same corridor. One of the things I need to find out from my contact in Cheyenne is how deep this goes. If it goes deeper, then what we're carrying in that box is more important than just saving your ranch. He met her eyes. And more dangerous. She considered that. She was not a woman who refused to look at the dimensions of what she was walking into. We go anyway, she said. I know, he said. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Good. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that counted. They arrived in Cheyenne on the 3rd afternoon. The city was larger than Dunbar in the way that all territorial capitals felt larger than the towns they oversaw, not just physically bigger but denser with implication, with the sense that decisions made in its buildings traveled outward for hundreds of miles. Evelyn had been here twice before, both times for livestock transactions. She had never arrived with a locked box of fraud evidence and a man using a name that wasn't quite his. Silas's contact was a man named Alderman. He met them not at a government building, but at a private office above a law firm on the second-best street in Cheyenne, the kind of address that said serious without saying official, which Evelyn understood was intentional. Alderman was 50, compact, gray at the temples, with the manner of a man who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided and had learned to reveal nothing until he'd decided it was safe. He shook Silas's hand the way men shake hands when they've been through something together, and not all of it was good. Connell, he said. Alderman. Silas paused. This is Evelyn Mercer. It's her property. Alderman looked at her with the professional assessment of someone who had been doing this a long time and had learned that the people who showed up in rooms like this were not always who you expected. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I've already heard the name Garrett Hollow more than once in the past year. Sit down. They sat. Silas opened the document box. For 2 hours they talked. Or rather, Silas and Alderman talked, with a shared professional shorthand that moved faster than Evelyn could always follow, names of statutes, jurisdictional frameworks, chains of authority. She focused on what she could follow, which was the substance. She watched Alderman's face as he went through the documents, watched for the moment when his professional neutrality encountered something that broke through it. It happened when he reached the Prater originals alongside Evelyn's. He held them side by side without speaking for a solid minute. Same clause, he said. Same language, Silas said. Verbatim. And the appraiser in both cases. Dolan, Walt Dolan, county engineer. Hollow's Beau. Brother-in-law, yes. Alderman set the documents down. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. You surfaced to bring me this. Yes. That means people who've been looking for James Connell may now know where James Connell is. Possibly. Alderman studied him. You knew that when you came. Yes. Another silence. Alderman looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Mercer, your ranch, is it still yours as of today? I have 31 days before the banknote is called, she said. He calculated something. That's tight. I know it's tight, she said. I didn't come here because I had time. He almost smiled. He picked up the document summary, Silas's 12 pages, and read the first 3 with the speed of someone who knew how to read documents like this. This is very good, he said, not looking up. Silas said nothing. Alderman finished the 3 pages and set it down. I need 2 weeks. I need to put this in front of people I trust and verify the jurisdictional basis before I can move formally. I have 31 days, Evelyn said. 2 weeks leaves you 19 days. That's enough for a preliminary injunction against the foreclosure if we have what I think we have. He looked at Silas again. Connell, if I start making noise in Cheyenne about First Territorial and Garrett Hollow and a land fraud pattern, make the noise, Silas said. It came out flat and final. I'm done being quiet. Alderman looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded. 2 weeks, he said. Go back to the ranch. Document anything new that happens. Don't confront Hollow directly, and he picked up the document summary again. Tell me where you're staying tonight. They told him. He walked them to the door and shook Silas's hand again, and this time the handshake held a beat longer than a professional one needed to. Glad you're not dead, Alderman said. It came out more genuine than he'd probably intended. Glad I'm not dead either, Silas said. They were back at the Mercer Ranch in 3 days, and Garrett Hollow was waiting. Not at the gate. That would have been too direct, too attributable. He was at the property line, on horseback, watching, with Briggs and 2 other men flanking him. They were on Hollow's land, technically, but positioned at the survey marker like a statement about who owned what they were looking at. Evelyn pulled her horse up at the gate and looked at him across the distance. Hollow looked back. He was a big man, well-dressed even on horseback, with the patient, comfortable expression of someone who had been winning for a long time, and saw no particular reason that would change. He said nothing. He just looked. She looked back. Then she rode through her gate, dismounted, and handed her horse to Hector without hurrying. He's rattled, Silas said quietly, from beside her, looking back at Hollow's silhouette against the afternoon sky. He's not rattled, she said. He's watching. Same thing for a man like that. She looked at Silas. He was watching Hollow with the expression of someone who has been afraid of a thing for a long time and has just looked at it directly and found it smaller than the fear of it had been. You all right? She asked. Yes, he said, and then after a pause, I think I actually am. She turned toward the house. Good, she said, because it's about to get harder. Hollow didn't wait long to make his next move. 4 days after they returned from Cheyenne, Prescott showed up at the ranch. Not with another letter this time, in person, which Evelyn had told Silas would eventually happen. He came alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or a calculation that a lone banker looked less threatening than a banker with men behind him. Either way, he pulled up in a 2-horse buggy at 9 in the morning and sat in it until Evelyn came out to the porch, because he apparently didn't feel comfortable coming to the door himself. She stood on the porch and waited. He climbed down from the buggy with the particular stiffness of a man who had been rehearsing something and was now second-guessing it. He was thin, Prescott, with a banker's soft hands and a banker's careful wardrobe, and the eyes of a man who knew he was standing in a place he had helped create and didn't entirely like being there. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I'd like to discuss your situation. My situation, she said. Not a question. The note. The timing. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He didn't come up them. There may be room for a modified arrangement. Behind her, she heard Silas come to stand in the doorway. She didn't turn. What kind of modified arrangement? She asked. Prescott shifted his weight. An extension. 60 additional days. In exchange for... He stopped. The rehearsed thing was encountering something he hadn't rehearsed for, which was the quality of her stillness. In exchange for a commitment to negotiate in good faith with territorial land associates regarding a partial sale of the eastern acreage. The eastern acreage. The railroad corridor. No, she said. He blinked. He'd expected more conversation before that word. Mrs. Mercer, you have to understand your position. I understand my position exactly, she said. Better than you do. Better, I suspect, than Mr. Hollow does at this moment. She kept her voice level. You've altered loan documents for at least 2 properties in this county. You've used a county official in a personal relationship with your beneficial client to undervalue foreclosed land. You've coordinated with that client to manipulate the water supply of borrowers whose land he wanted. She paused. I said no, Mr. Prescott. You should go back and tell whoever sent you that the answer is no. Prescott stared at her. Something moved through his face. She watched it go, watched the professional composure encounter something that might have been fear and something that might have been a very belated recognition of how badly he had misjudged this particular widow. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and his voice had changed register, lower, less rehearsed. Whatever you think you have, I know what I have, she said. Good morning, Mr. Prescott. He stood there another moment. Then he got back in his buggy and turned it around and drove out through the gate, and she watched him go until the dust settled. Silas came to stand beside her on the porch. He'll go straight to Hollow, he said. Yes. And Hollow will know we've been to Cheyenne. He probably already knows. A man like that has eyes in Cheyenne. She watched the road where the buggy had gone. This was his last attempt at the quiet approach. Which means the next one won't be quiet. No, she said, it won't. She was right, and she didn't have to wait long to be proven right. 3 days later, Hector found 2 of the Mercer horses cut loose from the south pasture fence. The wire not cut this time, but the post itself pulled from the ground, which required significant effort and was not something that happened by accident or by cattle. The horses were recovered 2 miles east, unharmed, but the message was clear. We can reach inside your property whenever we choose. Silas walked the fence line himself that afternoon, reading the ground around the pulled post the way he read everything, methodically, without rushing. He came back with dirt on his knees and an expression that had gone to a particular kind of quiet. At least 2 men, he said. They came from the north, along the creek bed. Same route as whoever blocked your water trough in the barn. He looked at her. They know the property. They've been on it before, more than once. I know, she said. We need to document this, photographs if we can get them. Written record today, dated and specific. I've already written it, she said. He looked at her. I wrote it when Hector found the horses, she said. Before I came to find you. She paused. I've been keeping this ledger for 18 months. I know the procedure. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent. It arrived and was gone quickly, the way his less guarded expressions always moved. They were 11 days from the foreclosure deadline when Alderman's letter arrived from Cheyenne. Silas read it first because he was standing at the mailbox when the stage came through, and Evelyn read it second, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. It was 3 pages in Alderman's compressed, efficient handwriting. He had taken the documents to 2 people he trusted in the Territorial Attorney General's office. He had also reached a contact at the Federal Banking Commission's regional office, which had jurisdiction over First Territorial's charter. The assessment was that the altered loan documents constituted federal bank fraud. The pattern of incidents, 2 properties, same county official, same coordinating structure, was sufficient to open a formal federal investigation. A preliminary injunction against the foreclosure was being prepared and would be filed within 5 business days before the note came due. Additionally, the name Garrett Hollow had, in fact, appeared before in Alderman's work. Not in connection with the larger railroad corruption network that had gotten Silas's partner killed, but as a peripheral figure, a county-level operator who had been noted but not investigated due to limited resources and jurisdictional complications. That part Silas read twice. Then he folded the letter and gave it to Evelyn. She read it through. When she got to that last section, she set the letter down and looked at the table. He's not connected to the men who killed your partner, she said. Apparently not directly, Silas said. Hollow is... He thought about the right word. Hollow is local. He saw the same railroad opportunity that bigger men saw, and he's been pursuing it with the tools he has. The tools happen to include fraud, intimidation, and probably murder, but he's not part of the larger network. Does that matter? For your case? No. He sat down across from her. For whether anyone is going to come looking for me? Yes. It means the people who killed my partner weren't directing Hollow, which means surfacing to fight Hollow doesn't necessarily put me in front of them. She heard what was underneath that. You didn't know that when you decided to come to Cheyenne. No, he said. I didn't. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing complicated in the exchange. It was just two people acknowledging something that had been done without certainty for reasons that had been good enough at the time. The injunction, she said, 5 days. 5 business days from when he wrote the letter. He calculated. We have about 6 days left on the note. It'll be close. Will it hold, the injunction? If the documentation holds, and it will. He said it without the head she'd expected. I've been through enough of these to know when something is solid, what we have is solid. She believed him. Not blindly. She had read the documents herself, had understood the logic of what they'd assembled, but she believed him with the additional confidence of someone who had watched him work and understood the quality of that work. What about Hollow directly? She asked. The injunction stops the bank. It doesn't stop him from sending men onto this property. No, Silas said. It doesn't. He stood up, went to the window. Alderman is also sending what he has to the territorial marshal's office. If they act on it, and he thinks they will, Hollow will be facing formal inquiry. That changes his calculus. A man under federal investigation who also sends hired men onto a neighbor's property is a man who's making it very easy for the prosecution. If they act quickly enough. Yes. He turned from the window. In the meantime, we need to not be alone here. She thought about that. Margaret. And whoever else you trust. People who can be present, who can witness. He paused. Hollow's approach has always been deniable. Everything he's done can be argued as coincidence individually. If he escalates now with a federal inquiry in motion, he's either desperate or stupid. I don't think he's stupid. Desperate then, she said, getting there. He looked at her with that measuring expression. Are you frightened? She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. Of Hollow? Not the way you mean. I'm more frightened of all of this working and still losing something I can't replace. She paused. The ranch I can fight for. The ranch I understand. There are other things I'm less sure how to fight for. He was quiet for a moment. She hadn't entirely meant to say that last part. I know what you mean, he said, and from the way he said it, she believed that he did. She rode to Margaret's the next morning and had a conversation that took 2 hours and covered more than either of them had intended to say. Margaret agreed to come stay at the ranch for the remaining days until the injunction landed, bringing with her a woman named Ruth, who had run a homestead alone for 12 years after her husband's death, and who Margaret described as the most practically capable person in the county, which in Margaret's vocabulary was the highest possible compliment. Ruth turned out to be 67 years old, short, and entirely unbothered by the nature of what she was walking into. She looked at the ranch and at Silas and at the assembled situation with the calm assessment of a woman who had met trouble in many of its forms. You have good fence posts on the east line, she said to Evelyn. Hollow's men always come from the north. I'd put a lantern on the north barn wall, visible from the house. Good idea, Evelyn said. I have more where that came from, Ruth said, and went to put her bag in the spare room. With Margaret and Ruth installed at the ranch, the waiting began, which was, Evelyn found, its own particular kind of difficulty. She had spent 18 months in motion, always solving the next immediate problem, and waiting for something happening elsewhere to determine the outcome of her own life was not a natural posture for her. She kept working. So did Silas. The fence line needed repair again on the northwest corner, not from interference this time, but from ordinary weather, and they spent a day at it together, working the cold ground, not talking much. In the silences between tasks, she found herself aware of him in a way she hadn't been in the beginning, not just as a presence or a resource or even a person she respected, but as something she was going to miss if it went away, which was a thought she couldn't afford right now, and which she pushed back down every time it surfaced. On the 7th day before the deadline, 4 days into their wait, Hollow came himself. He rode up at mid-morning, and this time he came through the gate, which was deliberate. This was not a man watching from a property line. This was a man claiming a right to be somewhere he wasn't owed entry. Briggs and 2 hands rode behind him. All 3 of them were armed in the obvious way, guns worn high and visible, which was a statement as much as a fact. Evelyn came off the porch and met them in the yard. Silas was beside her. Behind her, she knew without looking, Margaret and Ruth were at the kitchen window, and Hector was somewhere on the south side of the barn where he could see without being seen. Hollow looked down at her from the saddle, the way a man looks down at something he's been patient about for a long time. "I heard you went to Cheyenne," he said. His voice was what it always was, unhurried, almost pleasant, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it. "I did," she said. "Visiting friends?" "Conducting business." He let that sit. His eyes moved to Silas with a calculated lack of hurry, the same look he would have given a fence post he was deciding whether to replace. "I don't know you," he said to Silas. "No," Silas said. "You don't. You've been on this property a while now." "I have." Hollow looked back at Evelyn. "I've been more than patient with you, Evelyn. I want you to understand that. I've given you time and options. The note. The offer through territorial land. It wasn't an offer," she said. "It was a demand with a dollar figure attached." His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Hollow. She had noticed it from the first time she'd had to deal with him, even before Thomas died. He had trained himself out of readable reactions. He was, in that specific way, the most dangerous kind of person. Not because he was unpredictable, but because he was very patient and very controlled and had never been seriously inconvenienced. "You have debts you can't service," he said. "You have a bank that has called your note. You have a property that requires more capital than you possess. This does not have to end badly." "You're right," she said. "It doesn't." Something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected that particular response. "But badly or not, it ends the same way for you," she said. "We've given everything we have to the Territorial Attorney General's office and to the Federal Banking Commission. The Prater documents, the original loan agreements, the water diversion records, the county engineer's involvement in 2 separate foreclosure appraisals." She kept her voice at the same level it had been since he rode through her gate. "An injunction against the bank note is being filed this week. A formal federal investigation into First Territorial's lending practices and into the land acquisition pattern in this county has already been opened." The yard was very quiet. She heard a horse shift its weight. She heard the wind. Hollow looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Silas. "Federal," he said. Not to either of them specifically, just the word, turned over like a stone to see what was under it. "Federal," Silas said. Another silence. Briggs, behind Hollow, had stopped looking easy and started looking at his saddle horn. "You have no idea," Hollow started. "I know exactly what we have," Silas said. His voice was different now, not louder, but with a quality she hadn't heard from him in ordinary conversation. Professional, specific. The voice of a man who had done this before in rooms that mattered and knew how it worked. "I know what it establishes and what it proves, and what it will do to First Territorial's charter and to the land title chain on every property Territorial Land Associates has acquired in the past 7 years. Hollow stared at him. "Who are you?" "A man who investigated federal fraud for 8 years, Silas said. "Before I came to Wyoming." The silence after that was a different quality than the silences before it. Hollow absorbed what he was looking at, not a widow and a drifter, but a widow and a former federal investigator with a box of documents already in Cheyenne. And whatever calculation he was running arrived at a result she could see in the small, nearly invisible adjustment of his posture. He looked at Evelyn one more time. The pleasantness was gone from his expression, but what replaced it was not rage. It was something colder, the look of a man recalculating. "You've made an enemy," he said. He meant it as a threat. It landed as a statement of fact. "You made that choice when you decided my husband's death was the cost of doing business," she said. His jaw tightened. It was the first real physical reaction she'd gotten from him, and she held it like currency. "Get off my property," she said. He turned his horse. Briggs and the other two turned with him, and they rode out through the gate the same way they'd ridden in, unhurried, deliberate. But the quality of the deliberateness had changed. It was no longer contempt. It was something that hadn't settled into a name yet. Hector came around the south corner of the barn. Margaret and Ruth came off the porch. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ruth said, "You need that lantern on the north barn wall tonight." "Yes," Evelyn said, "we do." They put the lantern up that afternoon, and they put a second one at the east gate, and Hector spent the evening checking every lock on every outbuilding. Silas wrote to Alderman that night, a short letter detailing Hollow's visit, date, time, witnesses present, and sent it out with the morning stage. The injunction arrived on a Thursday. It came not by mail, but by rider, a young man from the territorial marshal's office, official papers in a leather dispatch case, who asked for Evelyn Mercer by name and handed her a sealed envelope with the formality of someone doing a thing for the first time that he understood was significant. She opened it at the kitchen table with Silas beside her and Margaret and Ruth and Hector standing in the kitchen without quite pretending they weren't there. She read it. Then she read the second document inside the envelope, which was a notice of formal federal investigation into First Territorial Bank of the Wyoming Territory and its principal officers, and a companion notice of inquiry into the land acquisition activities of Territorial Land Associates. She set both documents on the table. The kitchen was quiet. "Well," Hector said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Margaret sat down in the nearest chair with the particular quality of a woman whose legs have just decided they'd done enough for the moment. Ruth went to the stove and put the kettle on without being asked, because Ruth's response to significant events was apparently to make tea. Silas was looking at the documents, not at the injunction, at the investigation notice. His expression was the most open she had seen it. "Alderman moved fast," he said. "You sent him good material," she said. "We sent him good material." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen smelled like coffee from breakfast, and the kettle Ruth had put on, and the outside cold that had come in when the rider left. There was still work ahead. She understood that completely. An injunction was not a victory. It was a stay. The investigation would take months, possibly longer. Hollow had resources and connections that would make him a difficult opponent through a long legal process. Prescott and Delacroix would hire lawyers. The county engineer Dolan would claim he had operated within his authority. Every piece of evidence would be contested, but the documents were in Cheyenne. The pattern was documented. The federal jurisdiction was established, and Garrett Hollow, who had spent 7 years operating inside a local system he controlled, was now looking at a different kind of system entirely, one he had not built and did not own. 3 days after the injunction, something shifted in town. The first sign was the feed store. When Evelyn went in for supplies, the owner, a man named Greer, who had been carefully avoiding her eyes for 6 months, met them directly and greeted her by name and spent 15 minutes in conversation that managed to include 3 separate mentions of what a shame the whole water situation on her property had been, and how he'd always thought the creek diversion was irregular. The second sign was the land office clerk Addison, who appeared at her gate on a Saturday morning with a folder of documents he said he'd been meaning to return to her, which was not accurate, since he'd never been given them, but which she understood to mean he was repositioning himself relative to a legal situation he could now see the shape of. "You know what he's doing," Silas said, watching from the porch as Addison drove away. "He's deciding whose side he was always on," she said. "Yes." "That's fine," she said. "If he was always on mine, I have no objection to him remembering it." Silas made a sound that was closer to a real laugh than anything she'd heard from him. It surprised them both. She looked at him. He looked slightly surprised at himself. "Sorry," he said. "Don't apologize," she said. "You should do that more." He looked at her with an expression that had no armor in it at all, for just a moment, before the habit of composure returned. The formal notice of proceedings against Garrett Hollow arrived in Dunbar 4 weeks after the injunction, served by a federal marshal from Cheyenne who made no particular drama of the delivery, but who was, Evelyn understood, the visible sign of something that had already been in motion for a while. Hollow received the papers at his ranch. Evelyn didn't see that happen, but the county had enough functioning gossip that by the end of the week she knew from 3 separate sources that Briggs had been seen leaving the Hollow property with 2 horses packed heavy, and that Hollow himself had ridden to Casper for what was described as a meeting with lawyers, and that the 2 saloons he owned in Dunbar were being managed by their day staff with an absence of the usual casual authority. A man who has been running the referees for 7 years, Evelyn thought, looks a great deal smaller when the referees change. She was in Thomas's office on a Wednesday evening, at the desk where she'd sat through 100 sleepless nights with her ledger, when Silas came in and stood in the doorway. "Alderman wrote again," he said. He had the letter in his hand. She turned. "What does it say?" "Delacroix has agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation. In exchange for reduced charges, he's prepared to provide documentation of the instruction to alter the Prater loan terms." He paused. "The instruction came from Hollow through a third party. Alderman says it's enough to support a fraud charge with Hollow's name on it." She looked at him. "Also," he said, "the inquiry into Thomas's death has been formally reopened. A territorial investigator, not the county deputy, based on the pattern of activity surrounding the property." She sat with that for a moment. Not the way she sat with tactical information, differently. She felt it move through her chest the way things move when they've been held under pressure for a long time, and the pressure has shifted. "Will they find anything?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She'd made it steady. "I don't know," he said. He said it without comfort and without false assurance, which was the right answer. "But it will be looked at by people who don't work for Hollow. That's something." "It's something," she agreed. He came into the room and sat in the second chair, the one that had always been for a visitor. Thomas's desk between them, Thomas's map on the wall, Thomas's penciled stars in the margins of the survey. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He had something to say and was finding the approach to it. She had noticed he did this. He was decisive about almost everything except the things that cost him the most to say, and those he came at from the side. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, "after the investigation runs its course, after the legal proceedings." He looked at his hands. "I don't know that I want to go back to the work I used to do, even if it were possible." "What do you want to do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been useful here," he said, "in ways that don't require—" He paused. "I can look at fence lines and water tables and property surveys and see things that take other people longer to see. That's a skill. It doesn't have to be applied to federal investigations." He looked up at her. "A ranch with 420 acres and a railroad corridor has a lot of complicated decisions ahead of it." She looked at him, at the careful oblique approach to the thing he was actually saying. "You're asking if you can stay," she said. He stopped. "Yes. I'm asking if I can stay." The lamp between them was steady. Outside, the north range held the last of the day's light. "That's the most direct you've been about something personal since you got here," she said. "I know. I notice it's still technically phrased as a professional offer." A pause. Something in his face shifted, not quite amusement, not quite vulnerability, both. "Evelyn," he said, "may I stay?" She looked at Thomas's map, at the stars in the margins, at the 420 acres on the paper and the 420 acres outside the window where the light was going. "Yes," she said, "you may stay." He exhaled. It was a very small sound, and it carried a great deal. She stood up and picked up the lamp. "I'm going to start supper. Tell Hector not to be late." She went to the door, then turned back once. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "Or Connell, or James, whichever you decide." She paused. "Just decide." He looked at her with the expression she'd been collecting since the first morning in her barn with the lantern. "Silas is fine," he said. "For now." "Good," she said, and went to start supper, while outside on the Mercer ranch the last of the winter light lay flat and gold across the north range, and everything that had been broken was not yet fixed, and everything that needed to be faced had not yet been fully faced. But the ground they were standing on was still theirs, and the documents were in Cheyenne, and Garrett Hollow was meeting with lawyers in Casper instead of buying her land for nothing. It wasn't finished, but for the first time in a long time, Evelyn Mercer felt the shape of an ending she could live with. The federal marshal came back to Dunbar on a Tuesday in early spring, And this time he brought 2 deputies and a document case thick enough that the feed store owner, who watched everything from his front window, later told 3 separate people it must have contained 50 pages at least. It contained 63. Evelyn knew the count because Alderman had written ahead to tell her what was coming. A detailed letter, 4 pages, laying out the charges, the evidence structure, the expected timeline of proceedings, and the specific role the Mercer Ranch documentation would play in the case. She read it at the kitchen table on the Monday before the marshal arrived, with Silas sitting across from her and Hector pretending to repair a bridle in the corner of the room. The charges against Garrett Hollow included federal bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud property owners under territorial law, and unlawful diversion of water resources on public grazing land. The charges against Prescott and Delacroix at First Territorial were separate but parallel: document alteration, fraudulent misrepresentation to borrowers, and conspiracy in the first. Walter Dolan, the county engineer, had been removed from his position by the territorial governor's office pending investigation, which Alderman noted in a tone of professional restraint that Evelyn recognized as genuine satisfaction barely held in check. Most significantly, the reopened investigation into Thomas Mercer's death had produced a witness, a former Hollow Ranch hand named Cutter, who had left the county 8 months after Thomas died and relocated to Colorado, had been found by a territorial investigator and had agreed, in exchange for immunity from accessory charges, to provide a statement. The statement did not say Hollow had ordered Thomas's death directly. What it said was that Cutter had been present when Hollow's foreman Briggs had told 2 men 3 days before Thomas was found at the bottom of the ravine that the surveyor who'd been nosing around the north fence line needed to stop doing that, one way or another. Evelyn read that section twice. Then she set the letter flat on the table and put her hands on her knees and looked at the wood grain of the tabletop for a while. "It's not a murder conviction," Silas said quietly. He wasn't trying to soften it. He was being accurate. "I know," she said. "Briggs is the link. If Briggs cooperates, he won't." She said it without bitterness. Men like Briggs don't cooperate. They're loyal to whoever they're afraid of, and Hollow is still the one they're afraid of. She paused. But Cutter's statement puts intent on the record. It makes the pattern complete. She looked up. "It means Thomas's death wasn't adjudicated as an accident in the final record. That's—" She stopped. "That matters," Silas said. "Yes," she said, "it matters." Hector put down the bridle. 11 years that man built this ranch," he said. He wasn't talking to either of them particularly. Ought to be on record that it wasn't an accident. Nobody argued with that. The marshal's visit to Dunbar the following Tuesday was the most significant thing to happen in that county in 20 years, and the town's reaction was the reaction of a place that had been living under a specific weather system for a long time and had just felt the pressure change. People who had been carefully non-committal about Garrett Hollow for years suddenly had opinions. The opinions were unanimous, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about the nature of their previous silence. It had never been agreement, just calculation about cost. Greer at the feed store gave her a 10% discount on her spring supply order, which she accepted without comment. The land office clerk Addison filed 3 amended reports regarding previous water diversion complaints, all of them now accurately reflecting what the complainants had originally said. Margaret Holt, who had kept her husband's freight ledgers in 2 wooden boxes in her cellar for years, because she couldn't bring herself to throw away something that might matter someday, donated certified copies to the Territorial Attorney General's office and was thanked in an official letter that she framed and hung behind her counter. Clara Prater came from Laramie for the first formal hearing. She sat in the back of the Territorial hearing room in Cheyenne with her father's documents in a folder on her lap and her hands folded on top of it. Evelyn sat beside her. Silas sat on Evelyn's other side. They were not required to speak at the hearing. It was a procedural session, Alderman had explained, more about the lawyers than the witnesses. But Alderman had said it mattered to have them present, that bodies in a room told a story that documents alone couldn't tell. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Evelyn understood about half of what was said and asked Silas to explain the rest afterward, which he did in the hotel dining room over a meal that neither of them ate much of. "The fraud charges will hold," he said. "Delacroix's cooperation seals that. The conspiracy charges are the harder ones. They require proving coordination, not just parallel conduct. Can they prove it? Alderman thinks yes. The communication between Hollow's land company and Prescott at the bank goes back further than the Mercer loan or the Prater loan. There are letters. He paused. Dolan kept copies of everything. Apparently he was more careful about protecting himself than Hollow knew. Dolan is cooperating? Dolan is protecting Dolan, Silas said, which in this case produces the same result. He looked at his plate. The man diverted water from 2 ranch families and undervalued foreclosed properties to benefit his brother-in-law, and he's going to receive a reduced sentence because he kept records. There's a particular kind of unfairness to that. Yes, she said. There is. She picked up her coffee. But if his records finish what we started, then it's the unfairness you can live with, he said. Is there a kind you can't live with? He was quiet for a moment. The kind where the person who should be in that hearing room never makes it there. She understood he meant his partner. She didn't say so. She let it sit the way you let certain things sit, acknowledged without being pressed. What happened to the larger investigation? She asked. The railroad corruption. The men above your supervisors. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Alderman says it's still open. Different jurisdiction, different team. There are indictments pending against 2 men in Washington. It moves slowly. He paused. My partner's name is in the case file now. Alderman made sure of that. He died as part of an investigation that mattered. He stopped. That's something. She looked at him across the table. At the man who had ridden through her gate bleeding and barely conscious 18 months ago and was now sitting in a Cheyenne hotel dining room having this conversation, which was the conversation of someone who had come back from somewhere very far and was still finding his footing in the ordinary world. It's something, she said. They rode back to Dunbar the next morning. The spring had come properly now, not the tentative, retractable warmth of March, but the real thing, the kind that smelled like thawed ground and new grass, and felt like a reprieve from something. The East Creek was running again. The Territorial Water Authority had formally reversed the county engineer's ruling on the diversion and ordered the Upper Channel Dam demolished, which Hollow's men had been required to do under supervision of a territorial inspector. Evelyn had ridden out to watch that particular demolition herself, alone, on a cold February afternoon, and had stood downstream while the creek ran through where it was supposed to run, and had felt something she didn't entirely have a word for, not triumph, something older and quieter than triumph. The ranch work of spring was the same as it always was: fencing, planting, managing the horse operation, the 100 daily decisions that a working property of that size required. What was different was the working of it. Silas had stayed, as she'd said he could, and what that meant in practice was a kind of functional partnership that built itself out of shared labor and shared daily life in the way that these things build themselves, not through declaration, but through accumulation. He was good with horses in a way that had surprised her initially, before she'd stopped being surprised by what he was good at. He had a patience with animals that he didn't always have with people, a willingness to wait, to repeat, to let the animal find its own timing, and the horses on the south pasture that had been most disrupted by the poisoning incidents the previous year responded to him in a way that Evelyn watched with something she recognized as relief. Hector watched all of it from his usual position of peripheral wisdom and said nothing about any of it until one evening in late April when he and Silas were repairing the gatepost on the south entrance, and Hector, without preamble, said, "You planning on staying permanent?" Silas kept working. "That's the plan." Hector drove a nail. She going to know that officially at some point, or is it going to stay as the plan? A pause. That's being worked on. Hector said again, and drove another nail, and that was the end of it. It was being worked on, though Silas would have been hard-pressed to explain the pace of its working to anyone. He had spent 2 years in a life stripped of anything permanent. No address, no real name, no attachment he couldn't walk away from inside of an hour. That had made him safe, or so he told himself, though what it had actually made him was difficult. It had made permanence feel like something that happened to other people, something that required a kind of courage, different from the kind he'd practiced in federal investigations or in riding across a dark Wyoming territory with a bullet in his shoulder. He understood this about himself. He was working on it at the speed that such things actually work at, which is slower than most people would prefer. What helped was that Evelyn did not press. He'd come to understand, her own version of the same difficulty. Not the running, but the part about letting something new occupy the space where something irreplaceable had been. Thomas Mercer had been in this house, at this desk, on this land, for 11 years. His handwriting was on the survey maps. His decisions were in the fence lines and the well placements and the crossbeam angle of the barn loft he and Evelyn had argued about for 4 days. A man doesn't disappear from a place he built with his hands, and a woman who loved him doesn't simply clear that space for occupancy by someone else. What Silas had come to understand, slowly, and with the slightly uncomfortable clarity of someone who has been paying attention, was that Evelyn was not trying to replace Thomas. She was doing something more difficult. She was making room in a life that was already complete for something it hadn't originally contained. That required not forgetting, but expanding, which is harder than either forgetting or remembering, and requires a kind of daily courage that people rarely name because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. He admired it. He was trying to learn from it. The Hollow proceedings moved through the territorial court system across the spring and into the summer with a kind of grinding bureaucratic momentum that was unglamorous and slow and entirely effective. The fraud charges against Prescott and Delacroix resulted in guilty pleas in June. Both men, facing federal sentences, had cooperated fully in exchange for reduced terms. Prescott's cooperation produced the internal bank communications that established the coordination between First Territorial and Territorial Land Associates, which connected Hollow directly to the pattern of document alteration. Territorial Land Associates was formally dissolved by court order in July. The land it had acquired through fraudulent foreclosures, including the Prater property and 2 other parcels that the investigation had identified, was ordered into an escrow arrangement pending civil recovery proceedings. Clara Prater's lawyer, a sharp young woman in Laramie who had been following the federal case closely, filed a civil recovery claim for the Prater land in August, naming both Hollow and First Territorial as defendants. Garrett Hollow himself stood trial in Cheyenne in September. It lasted 11 days. Evelyn was present for the first day and the last, because the ranch required her presence in between, and because Alderman had told her honestly that the middle days were procedural and she wouldn't miss anything essential. On the last day, she sat in the second row with Silas beside her and Margaret Holt beside him. Margaret, who had driven 3 days from Dunbar at age 63 because she said there were things a person needed to see with their own eyes. And this was one of them. Hollow sat at the defendant's table in a good suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who have always been able to afford them. He looked at no one in particular during the reading of the verdict, which was either composure or the performance of composure. With Hollow, Evelyn had learned, the difference was not always visible from the outside. Guilty on 3 counts of federal bank fraud. Guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy to defraud property holders under territorial statute. Not guilty on the water diversion charge, because the jurisdictional argument had been complicated enough that the jury couldn't reach consensus, which Alderman had warned was possible. The Cutter's statement about Thomas's death had been entered as evidence in the conspiracy charge, but had not resulted in a separate criminal referral. There was not, in the end, enough direct evidence to support a murder charge against Hollow specifically, and the territorial prosecutor had made the decision not to pursue a case he couldn't win. That was the part Evelyn had expected and had prepared herself for across the months of proceedings, and she had managed it the way she managed most things that were unfair but unchangeable. She absorbed it, she sat with it, and she did not pretend it wasn't there. Thomas Mercer's death was recorded in the official proceedings as having occurred in circumstances consistent with the organized campaign of intimidation and property fraud for which Garrett Hollow was convicted. It was not a murder conviction. It was something in between justice and its absence, which is where most things land when you pursue them long enough and honestly enough to find out their actual dimensions. After the verdict was read, in the corridor outside the hearing room, Margaret found Evelyn's arm and held it for a moment without saying anything. That was enough. Hollow was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial penitentiary and ordered to pay substantial financial penalties that would consume most of what he'd spent years accumulating. The hollow cattle operation was not taken. His wife and adult son retained the original ranch property and the core herd, but the expansion properties, the saloons, the financial interests in Dunbar's commercial district, the various land holdings acquired under the Territorial Land Associates structure. All of it unwound in the months that followed in a series of civil judgments that made the county's attorneys very busy and the county's gossip network equally so. In Dunbar, things changed in the particular way that things change in small places when the organizing force of them is removed. Not everything at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The land office got a new clerk, a young woman named Sayers who had no connections to anyone and who processed every complaint with an efficiency that old-timers found slightly startling. The county engineer position was filled by a man from Casper who had references from the territorial government rather than from local businessmen. Greer at the feed store raised his prices back to normal, which Evelyn considered more honest than the discount. First Territorial Bank reorganized under new management following its federal consent decree, and the new loan officer, a careful, formal young man named Marsh, who had been sent from the parent institution in Denver specifically to rehabilitate the branch's reputation, processed Evelyn's note extension without drama at terms that reflected the actual market rate. She signed the paperwork in his office on a Thursday afternoon and shook his hand and rode home in the early October light. The hills were doing what they did in October, going from green to gold to the particular amber that preceded the long brown of winter, and the creek ran steady on the east side of her property, the way it had always been supposed to run. Silas was at the gate when she came through. He'd been fixing the gate hardware, which had been on the to-do list since July and had been crowded out by everything else. He had the old hinge off and the new one in his hand when she rode up. "Done?" he asked. "Signed and filed," she said. She dismounted and walked her horse inside the gate. "The note is extended at 4.5% for 5 years." "That's reasonable." "It is." She looked at the gate hardware in his hand. "How's it coming?" "Almost done. The post shifted over the winter. I'm going to need to reset it before it gets cold." She looked at the post. It had been the same post since the first winter she and Thomas had been on the property. They'd set it together in October of the first year, when the gate was new and the ranch was mostly dreams and debt. And Thomas had hit it with the maul handle because he was impatient, and the post had gone in crooked, and they'd had to pull it and reset it, and she'd teased him about it for the rest of the autumn. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. "I'll help you reset it," she said, "after supper." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "I want to reset it right." He understood what she meant by right, and he nodded, and they went inside. Supper that evening was the ordinary kind. Hector had made something with the last of the summer's preserved vegetables, and it was not as good as he believed it to be, which was normal, and they ate it without complaint, which was also normal. The conversation covered the fence on the northwest line and the horse that had been limping since Tuesday, and whether to try to get one more cutting of hay from the south meadow before the freeze came. Evelyn listened to herself talking about hay and fence lines, and felt, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, that this was sufficient, that these were the right things to be talking about on an October evening in a warm kitchen. Not because nothing hard had happened or because everything had been resolved cleanly, it hadn't, but because this was what survival into ordinary life looked like. The ranch ran, the horses were healthy, the land was theirs. The man across the table was staying. These things had been fought for, and they were here, and they were enough. After supper, she and Silas went out to the gate in the last of the light. They pulled the post, which was tilted 3 degrees from vertical, enough that it had been bothering Silas every time he looked at it, she suspected, for some time. They dug the base, repacked the hole, and drove the post back in plumb. Silas held it while Evelyn drove the maul. She was better at it than he was, which had taken him about a week in the beginning to stop being surprised by, and which he'd long since stopped pretending otherwise. The post went in straight. They stood back and looked at it. The new hinge went on clean, and the gate swung without catching, and the hardware held. "That's right," she said. "It is," he agreed. The light was almost gone. The north range was dark beyond the fence line, the same dark it had always been on nights without a moon, the same dark through which a wounded stranger had come riding on the worst night of a bad year, and she had stood on her porch with a rifle and made a calculation about what she could live with. She had been making that calculation her whole life. She suspected she would keep making it. The trick she had learned, the thing she knew now that she hadn't known before, was that you didn't calculate what you could live with in the future. You calculated it in the present, with the information you had, and you let the decision be what it was, and then you dealt with whatever came from it. She had stayed because she couldn't live with leaving. She had taken in a bleeding stranger because she couldn't live with leaving him outside. She had built a case and carried it to Cheyenne and stood in her yard and told Garrett Hollow to get off her property because she couldn't live with the alternative. None of those decisions had been simple. None of them had been without cost. Thomas was still dead. His death was still recorded in official proceedings rather than in a verdict, which was not the same as justice. The legal proceedings had taken 8 months of her life and would take money she didn't have in excess and would continue to shadow the ranch's finances for a year or two yet. Silas still woke some nights from what were clearly not good dreams, and she had learned to leave the lamp lit in the kitchen on those nights so there would be light if he came downstairs, which was the most useful thing she could think to do. But the creek ran. The land was hers. The man beside her at the gate had chosen to be there. She thought about Thomas's stars on the survey map. She had left them there, hadn't redrawn the map, hadn't removed them. Thomas had put them there because he'd wanted to remember where his land was in relation to everything larger than himself. And she thought that was still the right instinct, to know where you stood, to understand yourself in relation to the larger thing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," Silas said. "When you were running for those 18 months, did you have a direction, or were you just away?" He thought about it. He was good at actually thinking about things before he answered, which she appreciated. "Away at first," he said. "That's all it was, just distance. But by the end, I think I was looking for somewhere to stop. I just didn't know how to recognize it." "How did you recognize it?" He looked at the gate, at the repaired post, plumb now, standing right. "Because I stopped," he said. "Because something made me stop and I noticed I was still there the next morning." She nodded. "That's usually how it works," she said. "Nobody recognizes the right place in advance. You just notice later that you stopped running." He looked at her. "I stopped running the night Thomas died," she said. "I didn't have a plan. I just kept not leaving. Every morning I got up and didn't leave, and after a while that became the decision." "That's what you'd call a plan?" "That's what I'd call surviving long enough to make a plan," she said, "which is different but just as good." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Evelyn?" She looked at him. The gate was between them, half open, the way it had been on the night he'd come through it. The post stood straight. The light was almost entirely gone now, and his face was the face she knew, the one with the armor in it, and underneath the armor, the things the armor had been built to protect, which she had been carefully learning the shape of for the better part of a year. "I'd like to make it official," he said. "Staying." She looked at him. "How official?" "As official as you'd want." She thought about Thomas's stars. She thought about the crooked post they'd reset together the 1st October, and the straight post they'd reset tonight, and the strange math of grief and time and what you built in the space that loss leaves behind. "Ask me properly," she said. He reached into his coat pocket. She hadn't known he'd been carrying it, a ring, plain silver, nothing elaborate, which was exactly right, and told her he knew her well enough to know what was exactly right. "Evelyn Mercer," he said, "will you marry me?" He didn't phrase it as a question, entirely, which was also exactly right, because it wasn't a question really. It was a statement of intent from a man who meant what he said and said what he meant, offered to a woman who had been running this ranch alone for 2 years and had no interest in pretending she needed someone, but had come to want this specific person in the deliberate, clear-eyed way of someone who has learned the difference. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her hand. It fit, which she would tease him about later, that he'd somehow known the size. And he said he'd asked Margaret, which explained everything. She laughed. She had forgotten over the past 2 years that she could laugh like that, sudden and real and not managing anything. He smiled. The full version, the one without the armor, and she tucked it away with the rest of them. They were married in the house in December, a small thing with Hector and Margaret and Ruth and Clara Prater, who had come from Laramie, because Evelyn had asked, and Claire had said she wouldn't miss it. Alderman sent a letter that arrived 2 days before, and which said, among other professional updates, that he was glad things had worked out, which for Alderman was effusive. The Mercer Ranch, they kept the name, which was Silas's suggestion, made quietly one morning over coffee, and which Evelyn accepted with a kind of gratitude that she couldn't quite articulate, but that he understood, continued. The railroad came through the following year, and the depot on the eastern corridor brought the freight connection Thomas had seen in the land when they'd first purchased it, and the commercial value of the property doubled inside of 3 years. Hector stayed until he was 72, when his knees finally decided they'd done enough, and retired to a small house in Dunbar where Margaret fed him dinner 3 times a week, and he sat on the porch and gave unsolicited opinions about the weather to passers-by. Ruth became the person Evelyn called when anything required practical clarity, which remained often. Clara Prater recovered the family land through the civil proceedings. She did not return to ranch it herself. She had built a life in Laramie and kept it. But she sold it to a family that worked it properly, and the sale money let her start the small school she'd been trying to fund for 3 years. She wrote to Evelyn twice a year for the rest of their lives. The investigation into the larger railroad corruption network concluded 3 years later with indictments of 2 former federal officials and 1 very large financial interest in Chicago. Silas read the account in the newspaper at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and was quiet for a long time. And Evelyn refilled his coffee without asking, and eventually he folded the paper and said, "It's done." And she said, "Good." And they went back to work. His partner's name was Daniel Marsh. That had been his real name, not the Marsh who managed the bank branch in Dunbar, a coincidence Silas had noticed and never mentioned because coincidences in names were exactly that. Daniel Marsh had had 2 boys, now grown, and a wife who had moved back to her family in Ohio. Silas wrote to her once, after the indictments, a careful letter that had taken him 3 weeks and 4 drafts, because some things require that much care, and there's no shortcut. She wrote back. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph said, "He trusted you more than anyone. I'm glad you're not running anymore." Silas kept the letter in the desk. Thomas's desk, where the lamp sat, where the survey map still hung with its penciled stars in the margins. 2 histories occupying the same space, which was not comfortable always, but was real, and real was better than comfortable when you had to choose. On a morning in the 3rd spring, Evelyn stood at the gate. The post stood straight, the way they'd set it. The creek ran where it was supposed to run. The horses moved in the south pasture, and the new grass was coming up the way it always did, indifferent and reliable, the way the land is when you give it what it needs and stop fighting it. She thought about all the mornings she'd stood here alone and decided not to leave. She thought about Thomas, who had seen the value of this ground before anyone else had seen it, and who had built something real on it, and who had died for it in a way that would never be fully adjudicated. She thought about what it meant to carry someone forward, not to replace them, not to diminish them, not to pretend the loss wasn't the shape it was, but to keep building on the foundation they'd laid because that was what they'd built it for. Behind her, the house door opened. Silas came out with 2 cups of coffee and walked across the yard to where she was standing. He handed her one without a word. They stood at the gate together in the morning light. "Good day for it," he said, looking at the sky. "For what?" "For whatever today is." She looked at the North Range, at the hills beyond it, at the particular color of early morning on open land that she had been watching for 15 years and would watch, if things went the way she intended, for at least 15 more. "Yes," she said. "It is." The strongest frontier, she had learned, is not the wilderness you navigate. It is not the enemy you outlast or the system you dismantle or the legal proceeding you survive. It is the interior country, the place in yourself where you decide every morning what you will refuse to surrender and what you are willing to build. Some people are lucky enough to build it alongside someone who understands what they're building. Evelyn Mercer was, at last, and not without cost, and not without permanent marks left by the cost, one of those people. The gate stood open. The morning came in.